where leadership is through merit and things like that rather than inherited. Also, this means that instead of being island-based or provincial-based or even nationally-based for political organisation, it's located more at a village level, so you still have ties that link you back to your village even now with the processes of globalisation. Colonialism did impact upon the Solomon Islands quite extensively because it brought in the Westminster system that still exists there. It brought in the idea of a centralised government, the idea of a capital, introduced the cash-based economy. It introduced employment through means other than at the village level, which were through subsistence agriculture and things like that. It also introduced the arbitrary boundaries that form the provinces. So that's where you get the idea of Guadalcanal and the idea of Malacca, etc., etc. Okay, so the historical development of islands and areas I've just talked about, so the idea of the provinces and things like that. This has influenced not only the way that identity is formed in the past, but also the way it's formed now, because as people start to move from island to island through migration, or from the rural sector to the urban sector, they tend to identify more with their island heritage than their local village heritage, which I guess is a way that you can see globalisation impacting upon the formation of identity as well. As they start to look more to the West, they start to expand the way that they form, the way they see identity structures and things like that. Obviously, key in the Solomon Islands is the idea of land. To have a claim to land is to have a claim to opportunity, is to have a claim for rights and some sort of basis to your identity. Without land, they effectively don't have a source of wealth and things like that within the cash-based economy. Because as the cash-based economy has come on, people have increasingly had to pay for school fees, they've had to pay for electricity, for water, and without any real access to cash at all, really. So the thing that they had was land. They had land which they could sell the logs off of to gain access to wealth. And through this they have then formed their identity because it's become so important to them to have a claim to land. This has been affected when people have moved from island to island or from the rural sector to the urban areas, because as people move, they don't have a claim to land in the place that they're going to. So for instance, as people have increasingly moved to Honiara, where most employment actually is, they have also lost any claim to land that they have there. So as they move, when they marry a Gwale woman, because land is inherited matrilineally within Guadalcanal, they gain access to land. And by gaining this access, they also, I guess, have some sort of a claim to being a Gwale as well. And it's interesting to see the way the structures work in relation to these particular instances. Okay, so within Honiara, there's a few different identities, and the boundaries that go between them are quite blurry. So you've got Malaitans who, well, I say in inverted commas because I don't know that you could say that they're Malaitan themselves. Links back to the heritage of, I guess, having roots or common descent from the island or province of Malacca. Doesn't mean that their parents were Malaitan, or it doesn't mean that even their grandparents were Malaitan. That at some point in the history of their particular family, they were from Malacca. The boundaries, I guess, of when you change or when you stop being Malaitan are very blurry within this particular instance. You also have Gwales. Gwales are, both Malaitan and Gwale are very new terms, I guess you could say, probably within the last 15 years these terms have occurred. To be a Gwale, you have to have long heritage on the island of Guadalcanal. You have to have had links within the actual links within the actual island of Guadalcanal for quite some time, and have, I guess, a link to land claims and things like that as well. There's of course the Chinese and Asian migrants that have come into Honiara and have gained access to land and customary land through potentially through government and through purchasing land off customary owners, they have also come to be a source of resentment for many people within Honiara because they're seen as profiting off this land that other people still see as having benefits that they should be accruing as well, which was one of the reasons in 2006 that they had the riots too. So the first approach that I looked at when I was looking at ethnicity in this particular context was the ordinary language approach. This approach linked the idea of explaining ethnicity to policy people. The idea that ethnicity was bandied about within policy circles without people actually knowing what they were talking about in more specific terms. So the idea of this approach was to say, okay, how do we make it so that popular usage of the term ethnicity correlates with what it actually means in reality? So there was a few different approaches. The latest one that I looked at was Elliot Green in 2005, who came up with common descent, common history, and a common homeland. Prior to Elliot Green, there was Furin and Leighton in 2000, who used the first two concepts, but also used conceptual autonomy. So the idea that the group that you're talking about can't be related to another group. They have to be able to exist on their own without having that alternative as well. The idea of conceptual autonomy, though, isn't very easy to explain to people. So clearly it wasn't common language or ordinary language that can be explained to anyone else. So Green got rid of that and put in common homeland. But all of these have definitional issues, I guess you could say, when you're applying them to actual case studies. For instance, common descent within his particular papers that he's written on this isn't that clearly defined. He talks about it in terms of referring to various different case studies, but never actually gives you a definition of what it's supposed to mean. When you look at other various different theories, you see that common descent actually originates with the idea of primordialism. That was kind of, I guess, the first ideas of what makes up ethnicity and the first attempts at anthropological work within case studies and things like that. Common descent was explained in other different theories, such as Ella in 1992 and Gil White later on in 2010, as having things like language, religion, customs that are similar, and the idea of a myth, a common myth that goes within the actual group itself. Okay, so the application of ordinary language approach within actual case studies. Common descent, I guess you could say you've got cultural characteristics within this particular area. So when you're applying it to the Mullahtan identity, you could say, okay, so do they have a common language? Well, when you look at the amount of languages that are actually spoke just on the island of Malata itself, there's quite a lot there. Do they have a common religion? Well, I guess you could say that they have a common religion in Christianity. The customs one, though, is very difficult because depending on which particular area of Malata you're looking at, if you're looking at the Kwayo region, which is, I guess, the mountain region in the middle is the Kwayo, and then they call them the bush people. Then you have the Solowata people, which I guess would be around the outside. When you're looking at the adoption of Christianity within Malata, the Solowata people adopted Christianity much more readily, and their adoption of trade goods and westernised goods, I guess, were much quicker than the people that were in the middle region. So I guess there is a difference in the descent of the particular people as well. But at the same time, you could say, well, they had the Messina movement, which originated in Malata, which kind of unites them as a common identity, I guess, as well. Common homeland. Well, when you're looking at Malata, as you saw, the province is quite open. You could say, well, is it the actual island of Malata that they're referring to, or is it the province? This is very up in the air. When I did my fieldwork in 2011, you asked people, well, does it matter if you're from the province of Malata or if you're just from the island of Malata? People are very non-committal. They don't really understand whether it's the entire province that you're talking about or whether it's just the island. Because if you're talking about the provincial level, You've also got the outlying areas of Ontong Java and Sikayana, which are Polynesian, which would rule it out as being an ethnicity because it has differences in descent as well, which is one of the key characteristics for being an ethnicity. Okay, so common history, you've got, as I talked about, differences in the adoption of Christianity and the maintenance of custom that came with the accepting of trade goods. However, there's also things like they all had some sort of influence from World War II. So all Malaitans and all Gwales all had some influence from World War II, and they were impacted quite heavily by this because that brought the American mentality of a work ethic and working for cash and working for a nationalism, working for something greater and something higher. This greatly influenced the way that the country formed and also influenced what people expected and potentially went on to then influence the movements such as the Messina movement, which occurred between 1948 and 1952. Okay, so this is a map of the languages in Solomon Islands. As you can see, Malaita's off to the side over there, so you've got quite a few languages that are spoken. And the same goes for Guadalcanal, where there's quite a few different languages spoken, and if you've been to the Solomon Islands, you'll know these islands aren't particularly big. You could probably drive around it in a day if they had the roads fixed so that you could actually make it the whole way around. But at the same time, Pidgin has become quite widely spoken within most areas of Solomon Islands. So if you were to say that language is a factor that may exclude a particular Malaitans being seen as an ethnicity, then you could say, well, within most of Malaita and Solomon Islands overall, they still speak Pidgin, so they still have a common language, which as a form of, I guess, common descent, that's quite important to make sure that they can all communicate effectively. Okay, so the next theory that I looked at was Rogers Brubaker and the idea of ethnicity without groups. It is quite helpful, I guess, when you're looking at groups that have blurry boundaries, where you don't really know where one group starts and the other one finishes if you're looking at it from, I guess, understood markers and assumed markers that we do if we're looking at it through a Western-centric lens. However, with this particular theory, the idea is that there's not enforced boundaries. It's rather more important what social and political, cultural factors actually cement the identity. So it's more of looking at from a bottom-up approach. When you're looking at this, it could help explain things like the idea that Malaitans had prospered unnecessarily from their movement within the government sector in Solomon Islands. So a lot of Malaitans achieved quite high positions within the government, and then of course their obligations to the private sector and the blurring between kinship obligations and the obligations you have as a public servant meant that a lot of the time they were giving positions to people that they knew. They didn't see that as corrupt, but people such as that have a longer heritage in Guadalcanal saw that as something like them ensuring that their kinship were getting positions of power to extend the power structures and where they actually sat. That's kind of, I guess, a social and political factor that helped to cement the identity within the actual conflict when you're looking at the ethnic groups. Another idea that Brubaker has is that existing groupness can be galvanised within different areas of conflict to make sure that, to create, I guess, a group or an ethnic group that may not have existed in its same form that it existed within the conflict, either before or after. So there may have been a sort of groupness that